Thank you all for coming. On behalf of Sherry Kassir and myself, Edith Gandelman, we welcome you to tonight's program, Exclusionary by Design. Zip code is destiny. Housing justice was actually one of the first priority areas in which the Racial Justice Initiative engaged, beginning with a very in-depth, oh, Henry's not here. Henry signed in at 6:30 and we're waiting for him to return. They're in Mexico. But,
there he is.
Magic.
excellent. I'm just speaking about you, Henry. Beginning with an in-depth presentation by fair housing expert congregant Henry Corman, followed by the community book read, The Color of Law, with a lecture presentation that we attended in Wellesley by Richard Rothstein. Then we made the issue real with 2 bus tours of Old Jewish Boston and teaching from Levine and Harmon's book, The Death of an American Jewish Community. We bore witness to the blockbusting and redlining that resulted in the decline of the Jewish communities of Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, where the population went from 90,000 Jews to 10,000 Jews in a decade's time. Our commitment to addressing systemic barriers to segregated communities continued with a deepening relationship with GBIO, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, and the most recent successful campaign that resulted in Governor Healy's signing of the $2.2 billion housing bond bill, the Affordable Homes Act, and a significant increase in the Commonwealth's annual operating budget for public housing. As you'll hear later tonight, TBE congregants are also actively engaged in efforts locally with boots on the ground action in Wellesley, Newton, and Needham, sitting in front of you. You'll hear from them shortly, advocating for fair and affordable housing with wins, albeit with some controversy now and pushback, for the MBTA Communities Act and other advances like allowing accessory dwelling units in our communities. So here we are 8 years later, gathered together again to continue our learning about zoning, how zoning was used as a tool of race, class, and family exclusion in Boston suburbs from 1920 until today. Sherry's going to introduce Amy Dain, who's our keynote speaker tonight and the author of the investigative report that helps us to understand how racial prejudice contributed to today's residential patterns and hopefully guides us in creating more just and equitable housing in our cities and towns. As we always begin our sessions tonight, we're going to start with a teaching from our Torah by Allison Kerr, who's TBE's Executive Director of Jewish Living and Learning.
I'm just gonna hand it. I don't know if I have enough. So hopefully
We can share.
what is that? And we can share.
We can share.
Okay. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you tonight. And I'm going to try to make a connection between this week's Torah portion and the work of Tikkun Olam, particularly around place and space. So the thing that I love about this week's Torah portion is that it's our Torah portion. It's the Torah portion where from whence TBE gets its name. And you can't see it now because the shades are up, but the Hebrew writing on these windows is in fact what's on the page that I've just handed out. It's a little bit more, I cut it down a little, but I think so that everyone can hear, I'm going to just read this. Right now where we are in the Torah is that last week we learned of the birth of Jacob and Esau, and Jacob and his mom, Rebecca, were able to trick, I'm using the word very loosely, Isaac, the dad, into giving Jacob the blessing that passes down the covenant between Abraham and God to the rest of the family. So Jacob, who's the younger son, actually becomes the leader. And this happens immediately after. Esau is very, very, very angry. And Rebecca has said to Jacob, you better get out of here because Esau has pledged to kill you. So Jacob, now we're on this page. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. Haran was the place where his mother was from, where Rebecca was from, and also the place where Abraham came from. He came upon a certain place, and the word for place is makom. And I just want to point that out because I've bolded every time in English that it says makom in Hebrew. He came upon a certain place and stopped there for the night, for the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of that place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place. He had a dream. A stairway was set on the ground and its top reached to the sky, and messengers of God were going up and down on it. And standing beside him was Adonai, who said, I am Adonai, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The ground on which you are lying I will assign to you and to your offspring. Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely Adonai is in this place, and I did not know it. Shaken, he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the abode of God, and that is the gateway to heaven. Early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. So from this text, what do we know about the word makom? You know it means place because I told you that, and it's all highlighted there. But aside from that, like, why would this word show up 5 times in, such a few number of verses?
It's a special place
It's a special place. What makes it special?
where God is.
It's where God is. So it's a sacred place because God is there. Anything else? Yes,
It's
Harriet.
sacred because it was recognized as being sacred.
Right. It was recognized as being sacred because of this dream. Jacob realized that God was there, and God had been there all along, but it was only Jacob's recognition of God that the place became sacred. So, and then what happens at the very end? Jacob does something.
He anoints,
He what?
he anoints,
He anoints it. He takes the stone that he had been sleeping on and he sets it up as a pillar and he pours oil on it, which is a ritual act of making something sacred. So not only does he realize that it's sacred, that God is there, but he wants other people to know that it's a sacred place. So he erects a statue basically so that people will know that that is a place where God resides. So, I have to say, in general, we're in a different like headspace about what sacred place can be, right? We have evolved over time. We used to have a very place-centric religion that was focused on one particular place in Israel, in Jerusalem, but we now have a theological belief that God can be everywhere. Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman teaches us that this particular place where Jacob had his dream is a biblical example of a place that's held to be holy just because it is holy. God already dwells there, as Harriet pointed out. So Jacob puts it beautifully when he wakes up from his dream and he says, surely God is in this place, but I did not know it. And he names the place Beit El, which is, short for Beit Elohim, the house of God. Taking this one step further, The Kotzker Rebbe, who was a Hasidic rabbi who lived in Poland in the late 17th and early 18th century, taught that we have the ability to create makom, sacred space for ourselves whenever we let God in. So that's a first step. If we are able to open our hearts and let God in, the place becomes sacred. Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who's a 20th century American rabbi, took this one step further. He extends the idea of creating makom by teaching that sacredness comes from our actions with other people. In other words, we have the power to create makom, sacred space, when we engage in relationships with other human beings. That is the essential work of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world. It only happens when we engage in actions with and for others. We create makom by working together to create a better world. So may we have the audacity to not only imagine a world repaired, but also to continue to do the work to make it so, moving ever closer to a time when all space is holy because we have encountered others with open hearts and loving kindness, ensuring food, clothing, shelter, equality, and freedom for all.
We are very fortunate to have you in our home. Thank you very much. Well, we're very pleased to have you with us this evening for our very special session on housing justice. We'd like to give special thanks to our presenter and responders. I'll introduce them later. And also to Henry Corman and Ann Houston, who were instrumental in planning and executing this program. And I think they're watching from Mexico this evening on Zoom. First, just a bit of RJI history. As Edith articulated, we were made aware of the crucial role housing played in promoting racial injustice through reading The Color of Law by Richard Wellesley. We had an excellent guide, Henry Corman. He showed us how disinvestment happened in our Black communities, zip code by zip code. We have been active in housing justice ever since. We came to understand how segregated Massachusetts is. While our Black citizens comprise about 13% of our population, in most suburbs there are about 1% to 2% Black citizens. On the other hand, while Blacks comprise 57% of Roxbury, 35% of Dorchester, and 36% of Brockton. This segregation, unfortunately, plays out against a backdrop of a severe housing shortage. The Commonwealth estimates that we are short about 200,000 homes due to lack of construction over the past several decades. The housing crisis and segregation has bad consequences. Our homelessness population continues to increase. In Massachusetts, there are currently 29,435 homeless individuals, a 54% increase from last year. Blacks typically comprise about 40% of that population. Health outcomes are affected. A white man in Back Bay has a 23-year life expectancy advantage over a Black man living only 10 miles away in Roxbury. Incidence of diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure is alarmingly 2 or 3 times higher than whites in our Black communities. There are economic consequences. While 73% of Greater Boston's white families own homes, only 40% of Black families do, so it is not surprising that the median wealth of Black households in the United States is a mere $24,000 compared to $188,000 for white families. So what to do? RJI powered up with the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, an organization of about 55 communities of faith
We see this issue through a lens of morality and holiness. The campaign was aimed to secure significant additional funding for public housing, both in capital dollars as well as operating expense, as a part of Governor Healy's Affordable Homes Act. Secretary of Housing Augustus reported that the new funding, $2.2 billion, as Edith pointed out, in a bond bill over 5 years, would touch over 43,000 apartments. GBIO and RJI helped some communities execute the MBTA Communities Act, signed into law by our Republican Governor Baker. The act requires 177 communities to have at least one zoning district where construction of multi-family housing near MBTA facilities is allowed by right. There have been bumps. You might hear about one in Needham from our guest Heidi Frail. We were not successful in passing the real estate transfer fee, which would have generated significant new funding for affordable housing. But overall, RJI and GBIO made progress. Thank you all for showing up at the GBIO housing actions and at the State House, and for writing your legislators. We really appreciate it. However, most housing rules and regulations work at the town level. It turns out that even when a developer manages to secure funding, he or she can be stopped cold by local zoning boards and town meetings. Neighbors have risen up to so effectively they have a name, the NIMBY movement, not in my backyard. This evening, we're focusing on local opportunities and challenges and how you can help. We'll lead with an overview by Amy Dain, a nationally recognized public policy researcher who has sifted through tons of town bylaws, amendments, and minutes, and history to write Exclusionary by Design. I highly recommend it. We will then turn to our panel of respondents for further conversation. Deb Crossley, who served as a city councilor for 14 years, also led the council zoning and planning committee, which culminated in the support of the MBTA Communities Law in Newton. She will serve on the Newton Zoning Board of Appeals and is a member of Newton for Everyone. Deb, you just raise your hand. Our own Anne-Marie Alonza, a 2022 Zeta Champion recipient. She is the founding member of Building a Better Wellesley and recently served on the Wellesley Select Board. She is a 10-year member of Wellesley Town Meeting. And Heidi Frail, who has been a member, who has been a member of the Needham Select Board since 2022, with a focus on addressing Needham's housing shortage. She previously was a 2-term member of Needham's Town Meeting. We are thrilled to have this dedicated group of experts with us. Amy, I turn the floor to you.
Thank you. Bring my presentation up. Yeah, there we are.
Great.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. What a great synagogue. It's my first time here. I'm really happy to be here. Today, I'm going to be taking us a little bit back in time to the 1970s. Because in the early 1970s, most of Boston's suburbs voted to eliminate apartment zoning or highly restrict it. It was a remarkable moment in zoning history. So much reform, suburb by suburb, all at once. It raises the question of why all of that rezoning happened then. And that's the topic of my talk today. So the focus of the presentation is highlighting the findings of this report I wrote for Boston Indicators at the Boston Foundation last year. As background, I conducted 2 large-scale zoning studies in Greater Boston, published in 2005 and in 2019. And in those studies, I found that the local zoning laws significantly ban or restrict lower cost types of housing across many jurisdictions. So many experts in planning and urban economics have shown that such restrictive zoning has the effect of segregating metropolitan areas by race and class. And the restrictive zoning has a name, exclusionary zoning. When towns zone out diverse housing, they zone out diverse people. But reporters would often ask me when I release these various reports, why do municipalities do this? Why do they so tightly restrict development of apartments in particular? And honestly, I'd stumble through my answers every time because it's just so many things and it's so complicated. Why is zoning exclusionary? And I think, is there solid evidence that the exclusion is on purpose? You know, I wouldn't want to just say, well, that's what's going on when, like, what's my evidence? I just know what the zoning says. Have municipal decision makers intended to exclude by class and by race? Can I say that? So lots of issues are raised at zoning hearings. You've probably been there, that relate to issues like density, related to that, traffic, parking, aesthetics, flooding, water quality, privacy, shadows, and infrastructure capacity, among like so many other issues as well. And so these are all real issues, and these are things like I care about in my community, for sure. But like, are these what it's all about? Is this it? Is this why zoning is so exclusionary? Exclusion is a side effect of like taking care of these other things. And so that's the big question for my presentation, and not just for the 1970s, which I said I'm going to be talking about, but really like for the whole history of zoning into the current day. But I'm going to focus on the 1970s as like my case study to explore this question. Why do municipalities adopt zoning that's exclusionary and causes segregation? Is the exclusion a side effect and not the intent of zoning? Or is social class elitism a primary driver of the policy, and is racism as well? So to figure out the history and understand this, I read municipal housing plans from the 1950s and 1960s. And I also did a deep dive into the Boston Globe archives, and I read state reports and other materials. I found in the 2 decades before the 1970s, the mid-century era, the post-war era, the debate about whether to zone for apartments went like this. On the pro side, there's the need for the housing. People would recognize that in the discussions. And they'd say apartments are a fiscal benefit for communities. Apartments don't usually have a lot of kids in them, and schools are expensive. And this is the era of the baby boom, and they're building schools all over the place, and it costs so much. So they thought if we allow apartments, the tax revenues from that aren't going to need, related expenditures on the school, and they'll help us pay for the schools that we need to be building. So we should be allowing apartments for the fiscal positive. But then the reasons not to allow apartments were often that apartments hurt a town's socioeconomic position within the metropolitan area. Apartments sort of affect the municipal ranking. In this era, municipal plans were explicit. Zoning is a tool for recruiting and retaining wealthy people and for discouraging lower income people from moving in. And in a longer presentation, I go into some more of the details on that piece, but I'm focusing on the 1970s, so sort of taking that, from the 50s and 60s as a bit of a given. But there were a number of communities that considered the pros and cons and decided to ban apartments completely or almost completely in that mid-century era in the 50s and 60s. So like Weston actually had like banned it from like way before then too, but is in that category. Weston, Carlisle, Dover, Duxbury, Wenham, and other municipalities made up an executive belt of estate zoning. They figured they could forego the fiscal benefits of apartments for the sake of status. But in the mid-century period, in part for fiscal reasons, like I was saying, more communities allowed apartments than banned them. So many suburbs of Boston permitted hundreds or thousands of apartments. This one's Framingham. They had thousands of apartments in that era. And you know these mid-century apartments, you've seen them all around. And I lived in this one in the 1990s. It's in Newton. It was permitted in the 1960s before the region's big down zone. So in the early 1970s, as I was mentioning, especially in 1972 and 1973, most municipalities that had allowed apartments voted to ban them. This was a remarkable level of action requiring 2/3 supermajority approval. In some places, the zoning for apartments was like removed from the books completely. In others, moratoriums were passed. And some requirements were just tightened, for lower heights and stricter dimensional requirements to only allow like low density apartments. And in some, the zoning had already been revised in the mid-century era to require discretionary approval. And in the period of the big down zone, discretionary approval processes sort of became dead ends. So like earlier, they may have been getting more apartments through that approval process. So to restate our question, why did the whole region down zone at once? Now, there are a lot of factors, and I'm going to go through them quickly and then focus on the question of racism and class elitism's role in the down zone. So first of all, the environmental movement was gaining momentum in this time period, and development for sure has impacts on water, air, and habitats. And the anti-highway movement was gaining momentum and opposing growth and traffic. Also, communities had been suffering growth pains from 2 decades of hypersonic growth. So Acton built 7 schools in 15 years. Like that's a lot of school building. So communities were sort of like ready to slow it down a little. So we've got concerns about the environment, traffic, and growth pains. But if this were primarily about the environment, they could have allowed apartments just like away from rivers and wetlands. They could allow apartments in walkable hubs. And if it were mostly about traffic, they could have promoted public transportation and zoned for apartments by train stations. And for sure, some of the down zone was a reaction to growth pains, like in Acton. But apartments had been seen as a fiscal positive. And there was an understanding that compact development's more efficient for infrastructure than sprawl development. So like what I found so interesting reading the materials from this era is that ideas that later got called smart growth, you've probably heard that term, or new urbanism, compact development, transit-oriented development, were available to 1970s municipalities. Those concepts were mentioned in plan and document one after another. They were not only down zoning for the sake of the environment and easy driving and low taxes. They were banning all apartments like everywhere. The big down zone happened very suddenly and intensely at a specific point in time, at a time of racial change, of civil rights victories, and a growing call for desegregation of schools and neighborhoods. The big down zone was in the 1970s. I'm going to back up in my timeline to 1965 and walk us forward in time. So here's Weston's master plan, 1965, and it's stated, and actually Wellesley's master plan from 1965 or 64 had very similar language, but it stated that the social goal is to accommodate further moderate population growth in a manner consistent with the present characteristics of Weston. So Weston was 99% white and its residents quite affluent. And they didn't say goal to preserve the built character because the physical goal was stated separately. So this is 1965 when they had this social goal in their official plan. What was happening in 1965 when Weston wanted to preserve its social characteristics? So 1965 is the year of the Selma marches. 1965 is the year that Martin Luther King came to Boston and spoke at the Parkman Bandstand and before the state legislature, saying that segregation of the North is a new form of slavery. In the 1960s, Black migration to Boston increased. By 1965, 17% of Boston's residents were Black. In 1964 and 1965, US Congress adopted landmark civil rights legislation. So 1965, Weston and Wellesley have a policy of preserving their social population characteristics. In 1968, Newton's housing report, written by Newton's planning department, called out the racist attitudes they saw as animating opposition to housing. In 1968, Congress passed the Federal Fair Housing Act, a central piece of civil rights legislation in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination. So leaders of the civil rights movement and its participants understood how important housing policy was for desegregation. Committees formed across multiple suburbs of Greater Boston with the goal of opening up zoning. In these years, planners, journalists, state and federal officials, activists were calling out zoning as a tool of segregation. It was a crescendo of activism. In 1970, a headline in the Boston Sunday Globe read, "Will suburbs see the light? Rezone for apartments." And this was the big question of the 70s. So we know the answer. It was the big down zone. A state report issued in the 1980s offered this illustration of what had just happened. In the early 1970s, a US federal court ordered busing of students to desegregate Boston's schools. Reactions among many white residents were harsh, angry, racist, and sometimes violent. Zoning as a part of the school segregation story. It's a part of why schools were segregated and are segregated. But zoning doesn't make for good photos. It's mostly invisible and it's very obscured by complexity. So here I take you to the state library up at the State House, and this photo doesn't tell you the story of zoning as a tool for segregation because the story is in the books. In response to the big down zone and the mood of anger and confrontation, the state legislature required every city and town in the Commonwealth to write a local growth policy statement, to imagine the future they'd like to behold, and to think through how to accomplish that collaboratively. So this was designed as a conciliatory exercise in state and local partnership to support growth and change. Municipalities had to form local growth policy committees, and they were made up of the city manager, mayor, heads of the Conservation Commission, Housing Authority, Health Department, and Planning Department, and 5 citizens. Each committee would hold 2 hearings and fill out a really long questionnaire. More than 320 cities and towns, we have 351, so most of them submitted statements. They've been saved like a time capsule in 13 bound volumes in the state library. And I wanted to know how the statements explain the big down zone. What do the statements tell us about motives? So first of all, in a ring around Boston, municipalities articulated their growth policies as no growth policies. As a good example, Natick's statement said, "At this time and in the foreseeable future, there is little or no advantage in believing our mission is growth." This is the basic policy statement of the big down zone. Why was no growth a policy? The statements do mention environmental concerns, traffic, and fiscal issues. We can check those off. They're all a part of the story. And also the class aspect in the statements was explicit, the same as I had seen in the mid-century reports that I had mentioned and didn't walk you through as much. But yeah, we have at least our share of poor people. Look at the stuff I was seeing. One statement, for example, said town should continue to maintain its socioeconomic status as at present. The statements do not name race as a reason for no growth policies, while they do name class and other concerns. Now, the federal court had just intervened to desegregate Boston schools by forced, required busing, after the court found evidence in school committee minutes that the Boston School Committee had been segregating on purpose. Everyone knew there would be consequences if they named racism as a reason to stop growth. In fact, a bunch of the plans said, "I hope this isn't a gotcha exercise." There was a subtext to what was written here, and race was not going to be mentioned, but it was on everybody's minds. The statements do make clear that demographic change in the region was a factor in the down zone. Quincy's statement reads, "In the recent past, Quincy attracted many new residents, especially from the South Boston and Dorchester areas, due to their perception that the city of Quincy as being less metropolitan and more residential in character. The most direct impact of this condition upon the city has been the development of a strong sentiment on the part of old and new residents to limit the growth of the community, thereby maintaining this residential quality. So I just want to emphasize that it's explicit here that people are moving from Boston and the down zone is happening in response. Melrose's statement named social structure as a factor with people moving out from Boston. The social structure is becoming more urbanized. Melrose's direct stated response is growth is not needed. Milton is next to Boston. Milton's statement states that the goal was for Milton to stay substantially as it was, quote, to preserve and protect the unique character and identity of the community. Under the heading Major Growth-Related Issues, the statement lists the pronounced changes in the areas contiguous to Milton. So the area contiguous to Milton includes Mattapan that had just quickly transitioned from majority white to majority Black. Another major growth issue listed was crime and the apparent breakdown of our society. Belmont's goal was to maintain its status, and it saw itself as unique in resisting apartments while being so close to Boston. Belmont's statement reads, the continuing protective attitude and desires of the residents with their attendant political power will tend to protect the status quo and prevent change in the town from its single-family, two-family character. This town will remain a relatively expensive place to live, and so will attract only those families so economically situated. Needham's statement said, Needham's goals may be defined as preventing major changes to the physical character of the community as a whole. Now, the argument can be made that preservation of the built environment and character isn't about race. It's just that people like their towns the way they look and how they function, and they really do. I like where I live too. But I'm reading Needham's statement, and I come to this appendix. And the statement says, before the appendix, Appendix A represents the efforts of certain members of the Congregational Church of Needham and does not represent the consensus opinion of the committee, nor the Growth Policy Committee, nor is said appendix endorsed by the Growth Policy Committee. But they included it in there for posterity. So what does the appendix to Needham's statement say? The moral and human costs of segregation are intolerable. Opening up our town and others like ours is in the interest of all citizens. We picture Needham offering a broad spectrum of housing, from multiple family dwellings to single family homes of various sizes and values, so that it may have a more heterogeneous population. So a few of the local growth policy statements in those 13-bound volumes read more like Needham's appendix than Needham's statement. The exceptions call for integration. They call for diverse housing, for abundant housing. They represented a minority of municipalities at the time, but they spoke in a clear voice. Newton, Lexington, and Scituate are in this category, calling for diverse housing. Newton's statement has in its goals the, wait, I have to move on. Yes, Newton's statement has in its goals the development of varied densities of housing for all income and age groups, the commitment of the city to achieve the development of a sufficient number of housing units to meet the projected demand for housing. This is in addition to language about the need for integration. So the questionnaire that they filled out for the growth policy statements asked about what changes are needed to fulfill a municipality's vision for growth. So Scituate's in this category with the Newton and Lexington and Needham's appendix. Scituate's statement said, changes and attitudes of many townspeople would be necessary before the desired future could be achieved. As an example, many townspeople have in the past voted against most proposals to permit apartments. And this is actually what we see in Newton and Lexington too, that the votes were not there for diverse housing, even when the statement supported it. So context is important here in reading these, talking about the 1970s. Many Black people in the 1960s and 1970s moved to Boston for opportunity. Most of them were in the rental market for housing. Many were looking for apartments. The region's racial characteristics were changing. Urban areas were diversifying. most suburbs were 99% white. Some suburbs were 98% white. There were loud, clear, organized calls for desegregation, for diverse housing, for diverse people across the suburbs. In this context, suburbs mobilized tools of public policy, of public laws, for the preservation of the status quo, which was highly segregated. In this segregated context, plan after plan suggested that new housing should serve existing residents and employees and not be for outsiders. In my read, we can say that exclusionary zoning of this era was not exclusionary primarily to protect the environment and manage traffic and local budgets, but for reasons of social class elitism and racism, for purposes of protecting the advantages of suburban insiders at the expense of outsiders of the suburbs. This was done with the understanding that outsiders of the suburbs included populations called out for protection in the Fair Housing Act of 1968, including Black people. The bans on apartments served to restrict access by many disadvantaged people to the public services, social networks, and opportunities that many suburbs offer. The bans on apartments created areas of concentrated wealth and areas of concentrated poverty. Zoning put economic polarization literally on the map. Zoning undermined social mobility. The big down zone also led to our current era of housing shortage and escalating home prices. A 1979 report that the state put out in 1999 Globe quote. In the report I wrote for the Boston Foundation, I cover more history that actually covers from the 1920s until now. These are challenging topics, but I think that like understanding how we got here and getting a grip on the complexity of it and the nuance should help us forge solutions. And I look forward to like hearing your ideas for making our policies more just. And I really appreciate your energy and working on these issues and being here and thinking about it. So thank you. And it's an honor to have your attention. And I link to my reports and articles on my website, and you can follow me on social media, especially on Instagram. I've been posting more at Amy Dain. Thank you.
With the commentators, it comes to me that we should allow just a couple of questions on your presentation before we go forward. Would anyone like to ask a question?
Can you talk about Jamaica Plain and where they fit in with just where they fit from a...
Yeah, one of the things that for myself to dodge this question, but I like all my research is on zoning in the suburbs and not in Boston in particular. So my first study, I looked at 187 cities and towns, but not Boston itself. And then I looked in like 20 years later, I did another study looking at 100 cities and towns, but all like suburbs. So, you know, in terms of like Boston's zoning code and that piece of like exclusionary zoning, I haven't like looked at so closely. More here, like, of course, like what was going on in Boston with busing and stuff like ties into this story. But really like in all these like big reports I've done, my focus has been very suburban.
Terrific. Thanks so much. So, oh, sorry.
So,
Sorry, Elizabeth.
sorry, I was late on the take here. So, in one of the things there is one of the quotes explicitly talked about needing to change the attitudes of the residents. Thought it was wonderful that it was stated explicitly, and how much is that still in play now, and how do we get around it? How do we get past it or through it?
That's my whole thing.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, well, the question that we were going to lead with was, given the environment, given Amy Dain's research, given your experience, what are the opportunities that you see?
Challenges first.
I thought you agreed on.
We want to end with the positive.
Okay.
I will finish on your question too when we get to
Okay.
that.
So we can start with that bar.
Okay. And, no, that's exactly what I was gonna talk about, because, so here in Wellesley, we just, at our most recent special town meeting, town meeting, overwhelmingly voted down two very, very good housing projects. In good locations, walk to train, walk to schools, walk to shops, with virtually no neighbors, on main roads. Like, it checked every box.
One was taking the place of a dump.
One was taking the place of a junkyard. Other one is right now medical office building. So a totally, a piece of land that's already completely developed and paved. So not a single tree is gonna be harmed in either project. Matter of fact, more trees are gonna be added to both projects. And it was interesting to watch town meeting think about what is going on, and it comes back to these attitudes that we need to change. And I would say that's our biggest challenge in Wellesley. And it's, there are myths out there. So you have the myth that denser housing brings more traffic. In reality, residential housing isn't the traffic problem. It's not at all like commercial projects, not at all like an office space. You take the medical office building, for example. Let's just pretend there were 50 doctors in there who are seeing, 50 patients a day. You know, that's a lot of cars coming in and out of that place. Now you're going to put 50 houses or units, or it wasn't even going to be 50, let's say 40. You know, these people, they come and go at random times. Let's say there's 2 cars in each one. One goes to work, they come back at the end of the day. The other one maybe drives the kids someplace, runs to the store, they come back. People leave at 6, they leave at 7, leave at 8. I mean, this is not the reason you can't drive around Wellesley, right? So traffic is a myth, but people believe it. So there's that. We also have the myth that multifamily housing is going to which is definitely a myth in Wellesley. Like, we can
Can you
do
repeat
nothing.
the myth?
The lower property value.
Okay.
So there's nothing we can do about the lower property values. Our values go up and up and up, and welcoming for people in the community are not going to lower property values. But someone actually said to me, "You're gambling with my retirement." I mean, that's a real fear. I mean, just because it's a myth doesn't mean it's not scary for people. So you have that too. And you know, what I saw at town meeting was this belief that these are good people. I mean, I'm telling town meeting members, good people, they care about the town. So they don't really want to hurt anybody's feelings. And they're like, we'll just wait for the housing project that isn't controversial. Right? Like, we support, everybody's like, everybody supports affordable housing, just not the current project. No, we really like it. I would even live there, but just not this project, this stage. We don't want to upset the neighbors. And there were a lot of neighbors that showed up. I mean, people who lived a half mile away across a major road were like, showed up to put on the project. So that's just another, it's these attitudes, and it's a challenge of a lack of trying to educate people who aren't interested and they don't have time to pay attention until the project comes. And then all of a sudden they're starting from zero. There's a housing crisis? What are you talking about? Like, did you ever read the Globe? No. Well, maybe, but that's here. Can't you just build the housing in, I don't know, New, or can't you build it in Somerville or somewhere else, Framingham? So that attitude thing, I think is really in Wellesley our biggest challenge.
I think like community organizing is really a great approach to it. And there's an organization, Abundant Housing Massachusetts, that's been helping to organize new groups across a lot of municipalities. And the politics of it are really changing. And we've got like a local group that's like fun to be a part of. And people, I think right now are pretty like excited to get out and like meet more people and be engaged in that way. And it really changes the way local politics work when you have people come out in support of housing, because traditionally at these meetings, it would just be neighbors coming, and then the proponent of the project would be the developer. And so when you're on that board, and I'm on the planning board in Newton, then you have like neighbors, or I go also to some of our special permit meetings because the planning board's not doing special permits in Newton. But like when you go to a meeting and everybody's turning out is like really upset about a project, and they're just like all the issues they come up with, and they're people crying and like, I shouldn't laugh at that. Like, it's really intense. And that's the whole conversation. And you're a decision maker for the municipality. Like, you want to help out the neighbors, like who are there, and like be there for them. And it's like your role of representing them, and your role not necessarily to like represent the developer. But when you have even one person come and say there's a housing shortage in Massachusetts and we need diverse housing, it changes the whole conversation and gives the decision makers some backing to actually support a project. So
And I just want to say that in Wellesley for these projects, the planning board understood and supported it. The select board understood and supported it. And great people came out and spoke, but we had 2 awesome people who spoke at town meeting, and the neighbors brought 30, you know, so, and the way town meeting was run, those 30 all spoke at the end. And so there was, so the town meeting conversation was very balanced. But yes, join building a better Wellesley and community people, music segment. I
Now
love
we
that.
need to take this off the
Pittsburgh-
screen so
Pittsburgh
they can
community.
see.
So,
In Wellesley, is it also, we want people like us. We are worried about people who are different. We have a history in Wellesley of restricted covenants.
So people are smart enough not to say that.
And they're not gonna say, it. I mean,
No.
can you read the room? Is that?
Oh, it's absolutely. Oh, it's 100%.
It's
People will
100%.
say, no, we have
So-
people who are honest who say, I paid a lot of money to live here and everybody else should work hard and pay money to live here. Like, why should we work in? But most people say, to be honest, at all of these conversations, what you hear, it's so funny. They say, well, we support the affordable units, but why do we need the market rate units? I'm like, what? You don't want the people like you? No, they just want to kill the project. Because you can't have affordable without market rate. That's like a whole nother conversation. I don't want to take away all their time. So,
No, but it
that's-
also is everything that we've been reading in terms of how to be an anti-racist, or is that if we keep people that are different from us out, we never learn how to deal with people who are different from us.
So I will say that a lot of very good people who want to be anti-racist, who are anti-racist, are very excited to help Black people in Boston.
Yeah.
They just don't want them here. I'm just gonna be honest. That's what I see. Is they just want to help people. They want to help the homeless in Boston by building stuff in Boston. They want to do good deeds. They do a lot of good deeds. They just don't want it to affect their property values.
Do they bring up the schools being overcrowded too?
Let's move on to Deb and hear our first, this is just an opening gambit.
Well, the enthusiasm in this room is terrific. I looked at my expression of challenges a little more broadly, but the mythology that is so successfully marketed by the opposing forces is deep and wide and very difficult to contest. Amy painted a very much nicer picture of Newton in the 1960s and 70s. And I was not in Newton in those days, but by everything folks have told me in my 40 years of activism in the city, we were a more diverse and inclusionary city back in those days. We are less so today. I wanted to paint, so our big down zone happened in 1987, which I'll tell you a little bit about. But paint a little picture of Newton just to make sure we get the relative scale here, because we're a city form of government. We're well over 18 square miles. We're most of our developable land is developed in some way or another. And we have a unique development pattern. The villages of Newton, there are 12 or 13, depending on how you count them. We identified 12 of having active village center business districts that we thought we could build upon. Now, the challenge of the development pattern is that you have tight communities in each one of those villages who gather and want to protect their place. Most of Newton, from the first zoning, which I think was 1922 in Newton, tell me if I'm wrong, is zoned one and two family exclusively. And even at the time, the mayor of the city said, don't do that. That will create a very exclusive community, and, you know, what's wrong with having more? But the zoning also allowed for 80-foot tall, 6-story buildings with housing. And the zoning also allowed for multifamily housing by right in many parts of the city. So, the 1987 zoning reforms, part of the big down zone, but linked to the table there, eliminated all by right multifamily opportunity, all of it. In our village center business districts, and this happened very quietly. I lived in Newton since 1985, and happened very quietly. I was a member of the League of Women Voters. They had a land use committee. They were following all this stuff, I thought. The elimination of all by right multifamily was joined by our village center business districts, which used to allow 6-story buildings and you could have housing on top, suddenly said 2-story by right only. No special permit option, just 2 stories, no more than 2 stories in our village centers. And of course, then you couldn't have the housing above. You had to get a change of zone in order to do that. So no wonder that in the city of Newton, by now, the median price of a single family home is $1.8 million. That's a new build. That includes single family or a duplex, a new build, one side of the duplex. An existing home on the market averages $1.4 million. So what has this done? You know, this was exacerbated during COVID, which has put its own pressures on development. But this has been happening for decades. And only big developers can play in the city. Only big developers can stand to go through these lengthy, highly politicized special permit reviews and public hearings, Chapter 40B, comprehensive permit reviews and public hearings. And so you have these large projects dotting the city, and that's what people see, right? So increasingly, the challenges we have in our city, which I think are, you know, at crisis proportions today, is we have a whole bunch of seniors who are stuck at home, stuck in big houses that are not accommodating their needs. Some who are stuck living on the first floor of their big old house, okay? Our school enrollments have been steadily dropping for about 6 years at approximately 200 students a year. And this is not because of COVID. We did have a big bunch of folks take their kids out of public school during COVID, but this is a trend. And it's not just because birth rates are dropping. It's because young families can't afford to come into our city, and the cohort of young families of childbearing age is dropping precipitously as the over 65s, and particularly the older 80s, are growing. Struggling local businesses. This is one of the things, and you know, the opposition says, oh no, it's great, look, there's restaurants and everything. We have, you know, which you may be seeing, probably you have one downtown, again, we have 12. Right? So nail salons, banks are taking over bookstores and pet stores and so forth, and realtors, realtors. And vacant storefronts and high turnover have been increasing.
We get exercise.
Yes, we have those too, yoga studios, you know, and you know, okay, some of this is because big box stores have taken over and now online shopping has taken over. So what do you need more of when you have that? If you want to protect your village centers, you want more feet on the street. You need more customers right there. This thing I read today, this phrase, lingering pandemic hangover. This is a challenge for all of us. And we're just going to have to wait it out, but be ready when interest rates come down. Be ready by our planning, by our rezoning, hopefully, which will come up in the opportunities section. You know, when the construction industry stabilizes, which it is beginning to do, depending on what happens at the higher levels. And I'm going to even say our teacher strike in the city of Newton and what's happening today in other communities, the teacher strikes. They're being driven by, teachers have always been underpaid. They're still underpaid. But the distance between what it takes to live in a community and what you can earn in a highly respectable profession is enormous. There's just no chance whatsoever that professional young people, the teachers, hey, firefighters, police, and so forth, in Newton, as of a couple of years ago, only 11% of our city workers and teachers lived in our city. And a trend today is that young people are increasingly coming home to live with their parents if they want to live in Newton and work for City Hall or become a teacher. There's something wrong with this picture. Lastly, the organized opposition. And we have very well organized opposition in the city of Newton that came about as a result of opposition to several large projects over the last half dozen years. Two of which were during my tenure, two of the biggest projects ever that so far failed and stopped, the big Riverside project. And the other is virtually in my backyard, on Needham Street and Oak Streets in Newton, the so-called Northland development, which is a visionary project, but the bottom dropped out of the office market. They're now back before the city council. And I'm going to say misinformation, a gullible electorate, apathy. We had 26% of our folks come out and vote for a new council last year. Limited local news. In our case, we lost our newspapers and all our news sources for a number of years, and they started coming back just about 2 years ago online. And therefore, we have elected most recently very much more conservative anti-development city council who believe in protectionism. And the city council is really a problem going forward. And I'll leave the good news for the next phase.
So I hope you're taking away from this that if you would like to be involved in helping and Mara Lanza, Wellesley, Building a Better Wellesley, Deb Crossley to get you connected to Newton for Everyone.
Well, that'll come next.
Yes, okay, Heidi.
A question.
Oh, sorry.
Deb, is it?
Yes.
What is the project on Washington Street in Newton?
Or the barn.
Which one?
Where the
The
barn
one
used
that's
to
already
be.
built?
No,
Trader
it's being
Joe's.
built.
Where the
They're
barn
digging it
used to
up.
be.
Oh. Okay, so that's a project that was permitted before COVID and then stalled by COVID because it's a Chapter 40B comprehensive permit, mixed use, retail on the first floor and housing above. And Mark Development was the developer. He's a big guy, but smaller than the developer who bought him out so they could self-finance, because when the market changed during COVID, his investors dropped away. So a year went by. He's doing fine. He sold the rights to the project and it's being built exactly as it was permitted. So it's a nice project, actually.
How many units do you happen to know?
I don't remember. It's a couple hundred, but I don't remember.
Yeah,
the
it's pretty
exact number.
large. It looks
Yeah.
pretty large.
Sassy.
I just want to say, Deb, you talked about the complicated permitting process that developers have to go through. Yet I live in Wobbin and on every street, an older home has been knocked down and a big house is coming in. I have no idea.
Those are by right. Those don't require a special permit or a comprehensive permit. So you're right, I did say that, but I was referring to the large projects. I said only the large developers can play. And so they're building large projects. I probably didn't say that. I'm talking about the hundreds of units that can go up because our zoning doesn't allow for those.
What do you mean by right? I mean,
Oh, this is a really important concept. Is it okay if I explain it? And then, okay. So zoning is a book of rules. And in it, it tells you what you may build to say what you may not build, but you may not build what is not in there is what you may build, right? So it creates areas or zones in the city or in your town. And it tells you, okay, this is a 1 and 2 family only zone. And you may build this much here. You may build it, let's say 2.5 stories. You have setbacks from side yards and front yards and so forth. You might have a floor area ratio requirement. It shapes and sizes and locates the building on the site. So when you're seeing, and I know these projects, there's some pretty good sized lots in Woburn. And so on a larger lot, you're able to build a larger house. Then there's what you're allowed to build by special permit. The difference between by right and special permit is that with a special permit, you have to go to before a body. In our case, it's the city council, which is a political body, and it's quite messy. In many towns, it's a planning board or the zoning board of appeals who normally come in, or in many towns anyway, they come in with more relevant expertise. But there's a public hearing. So all your neighbors get notified, and then if it's a big project, it goes beyond that, and they all come in and have their say. And that kind of a process can go on for months and months and sometimes years. Chapter 40B comprehensive permit is a state process that allows developers to come in and circumvent their zoning in order to build housing that contains at least 20 to 25% deed restricted affordable units. So they can build taller than what's allowed by right in the zoning, or wider or bigger or whatever. Does that help?
Yes.
Good explanation.
It's non-discretionary, so if you look up your property, figure out what zone you're in, what the rules are, and you want to build a project that meets the rules, the municipality has to give you a permit. They don't have, if the project meets the rules, it's not for them to discuss and vote on, whereas a special permit or a rezoning of a parcel to allow for multifamily housing, for example, those are discretionary. There's a vote, you may or may not get it. And the way zoning works, something has to be allowed as of right on privately owned properties. They can't just say like nothing is allowed, like, oh, we just want open space on your parcel. That would be like a taking. They have to like compensate the landowner. And they also can't just say like all uses are by special permit, because it wouldn't be like a predictable law. Like you wouldn't know what's allowed on my property, what's not allowed. But by saying something's allowed by right, they don't have to allow beyond that. Like you have a right to build a single family house on like most properties. But then to do anything else, it's like this whole process, you don't know where you're gonna come on the other end and how long it's gonna take, and will you end up with a permit or not? Is it worth your time? Is it worth like taking on the neighbors?
That's why only the big guys can play, because they have the deeper pockets. Small guys.
So we're running. Remember when we talked about 4 minutes and how long? Exciting.
I'm Frail, I'm Vice Chair of the Needham Select Board, and led this project that was the zoning for Needham's MBTA Communities Plan. And one of the things about the MBTA Communities Plan is that it switches this condition of special permitting to a by right condition for the entire plan. And that is one of the things that so concerns our neighbors. So I would say, listening to everyone else speak, I'm, you know, yes, we have that too. Oh, we have that too. It's solidarity, please, because I feel you. But I would say that the most challenging situations that we find that stand in our way of making more housing choice available to Needham is the knowledge that's required, the education that's required for people to understand zoning, and then just the quality of fear that infiltrates a fear of change and a decision, I think, which is a phenomenon we're all maybe becoming very familiar with, to disregard the facts. This is something that I see in our national landscape, and it's finally kind of trickled down to the local scene. In Needham, that played out in a presentation of our plan, which was incredibly, like, ridiculously, frankly, well-researched and well-supported, and a lot of opponents who simply choose not to believe the reports that were generated by independent consultants and so on, and to say that's simply not true, which is hard to refute because it is. I don't know what to tell you. So we were very fortunate. We worked long and hard, and we were very fortunate to have our MBTA. We brought 2 plans to our town meeting, and they were both passed by significant majorities. But we are now facing a referendum, a special election that will be held in January after a successful petition for signatures, in which the petitioners garnered about 4,000 signatures to reconsider the zoning passed by town meeting. So I am so sympathetic to all of these things. I will say that what was most effective for us during our campaign to pass our zoning by town meeting was simple one-on-one conversations, which is time consuming and labor intensive, but doable when focusing on a group of 240, because that's how many town meeting members we have. It is daunting, to say the least, when addressing the group of registered voters in our town, which that number for us is 25,000.
Yeah.
So
I think you
challenging.
moved to opportunities. I'm going to
Yeah.
say that you moved to an opportunity.
All right,
So,
fabulous.
But I think Bud has a question.
Yeah, one of the things I heard was there was so much misinformation. People in the community were in front of Sudbury Farms, Roach Brothers, the dump. And they were asking people to sign a petition to have the vote. And they were giving misinformation out.
Yeah, they were, and it's
Yeah.
very frustrating. It's very frustrating. But it's not clear what the strategy should be for addressing that, because you don't want to stand up and call people liars. And you have to assume that they are coming from a place of, different beliefs, or at least I'm going to try to be gracious and call it fear. But there is an element of classism and racism throughout, a large element, probably. In Needham, we have a particular problem, or I shouldn't say problem, we have a particular phenomenon in which we're experiencing a tear down rate of our older housing stock at over 100 homes a year. And most of those homes are replaced with much larger homes of, 6, 7, 8,000 square feet on very small lots. And we have some larger lots in Needham, but most of our lots are quite dense and quite small. And the folks who oppose change do not see that as change, because it's change in a certain direction. Whereas when we talk about providing, apartments, condos, housing flexibility, multifamily, transit-oriented housing, that is, and mind you, in Needham, the highest height that we're talking about is 4.5 stories, which exists now by special permit. So really, that change is markedly less startling than the change that's taking place in our single-family neighborhoods. However, there are some opportunities. I am an eternal optimist. I do believe that momentum is with us. We do have a lot of support. We did pass town meeting with a significant majority. And I do believe that that this repeal effort will fail. Part of Needham's plan, and the planned, campaign is that, Needham's, well, actually, I feel really badly about it because one of the things that you mentioned in your talk, is the justification of local residents, the benefit to local residents. And I have to say that that is something that we are playing very heavily on, not only because it's true, Needham is aging, like many of our communities. In 5 years, we're going to be 25% population of 65 plus. And with nowhere to downsize to, you can see that the situation that you talked about where seniors are stuck in their single family homes. I mean, some of them would choose to stay there and that's fine, but many would choose to move so that there was no shoveling involved and no steps, but there is no place to move to. Similarly, if caretaking is needed in those single family homes, those people are going to have to travel from further and further away, making that more expensive and inaccessible. So there are some real problems. It also locks up our housing inventory. So you can see that there might be an effect on schools needed as well.
So we are quickly running out of time. So there are two opportunities that
we just recently, the select board of Needham authorized a LIP, which is a local investment initiative. Yes, thank you. Sorry, I always forget what that stands for. And there's a smaller developer who came to us with a project that is too small for our regular zoning and wanted to structure it as affordable housing and used the LIP mechanism, which is provided by the state. It's an existing thing. It's not something new that was made up, and brought us a project that really satisfied the spirit of the MBTA communities law. It's transit oriented. It has affordable housing. It is small, but compact. It's multifamily. And we were able to use that mechanism to enable that development, which is, just the smallest start, but it is a start. And the idea here, I think, one of the things that I really appreciate about MBTA communities law is that it brings this, it forces communities to reconsider this zoning, making it compliance based means that communities have to take a look at this. And I think that's really helpful to get elected officials to move the ball forward on these opportunities. But there are opportunities.
So if there's a verb that you'd like to communicate to any Needham people here?
Oh, yes.
And you can sign up for a Needham organization off of this sheet. Here.
Oh, fantastic.
Needham Housing Coalition.
Needham Housing Coalition. Fantastic group.
Deb.
Okay, so the hope for the future, the opportunity is in citizen engagement, education, and activism. I mean, it's appalling to me how few people come out to vote in their local elections, and your local government is probably more important to your day-to-day life experience than your state government, and then certainly than your federal government. You know what I mean? I mean, these are the people who are supposed to take care of your daily needs, keep your community in good working order, hopefully plan for the future so we have a next generation coming in to take over when that needs to be the case. So I didn't say that or maybe you did, I don't know. I led the zoning and planning committee for the last 4 years of my tenure, and that we started out by looking at zoning well before the MBTA Communities Act came in that was broken, what we knew was broken, that we had identified specifically what was broken in it starting in 2007, and was a major reason I ran for office in the first place. And at the beginning, this was the first mayor, Mayor Fuller, who gave us the resources we needed to really get down and dirty and do it. And at the beginning, our opposition on the council, we have a 24-member council. It's outrageous, but You know, people are saying, no way, no how, never gonna do this, no, it's not, you know, we're not, to how much, how far. Okay, so we got to the point, especially with the state rule coming in, clearly, we're gonna do something. So in the last 3 years, we were focusing on village center zoning, rezoning opportunities. And we passed it, and we created 3 new zones. The densest at 4.5 stories, and a zone at 3.5 stories, and then one that could be in the what we call multi-resident zones today, which are 1 and 2 family allowed by right. And but now you have to have, if you want to use this zone, it's optional. If you want to use this zone, you have to have at least 3. Wow. So we've thought this is a way to add what some experts have been calling gentle density, as a way to bring more housing in and around the village, in our case, the village centers or the downtowns, where we have a great structure. The opportunity in Newton with all of our different villages is that we can make many walkable communities. And 6 of our village centers have either the commuter rail or the Green Line right there. There's also Express Bus and the other ones, but MBTA didn't count that. Unfortunately, in order to avoid a referendum, because we saw it building, we have extremely well organized opposition. It's a smaller group, but they're kind of at it. And so the city council, many of whom believe they are elected to reflect the priorities of their immediate constituents, or their their preferred constituents. We weren't going to pass anything if we didn't reduce it to just meet the requirements, the capacity requirements of the MBTA zoning.
So Deb, just in the last 30 seconds.
Oh, sorry.
So the opportunity, if you had a verb that you wanted to.
Well, I just want to put this out there. The zoning is great. What we needed is an expand the map campaign. That's my idea, but to get there, I helped to found this organization called Newton for Everyone. And newtonforeveryone.com. It's a really nice looking website. It's in here, right? And this doesn't tell you how nice looking it is, but this page probably very quickly. We have over 500 members, and we have 8 citizen organizations ranging from environmental to housing to interfaith to the chamber. And so it's a really good start. If you're here from Newton, I hope you will sign in and get our free monthly newsletter. Oh, yeah. Go.
So I guess what I'm gonna say for opportunity for all of you is to get informed, stay informed, and get involved. Sherry started off talking about GBIO. One of the things that we've learned in Wellesley is what the only way to do it is state. But the state has to force the towns. 40B was the state forcing the towns, and MBTA is the state forcing the towns. And now the state has forced all the towns to do accessory dwelling units. And we have them in Wellesley already, and Needham has them, and Needham has those restrictions.
Yeah.
But these are opportunities that we have here because of state action. And I'm just telling you, beyond that, we're going to make no progress in Wellesley other than state action. So it's important to follow what's going on at the state level. And when Sherry sends an email out, it says, everybody write, please, everybody write. In terms of staying informed, you mentioned the chamber, the Charles River Chamber of Commerce, they have a free newsletter that covers all 3 communities plus Watertown. They are very housing forward in that. So Greg will mention the chamber president. He will report on every single housing thing that's happening, multi-family housing. Really, really great source of information.
Just email me. I'll make, if you're interested in being.
So please stay informed, because by the time I reach out to you to say I need you at town meeting, you're like, what are you talking about? Like, what's going on? It's like things are, if you don't pay attention every day, then it's like, meanwhile, the neighbors are there who are fighting it all the time. And the other thing you can do, and I just can't wait, first MBTA community in Wellesley, I don't know what it's going to be, first MBTA thing. I'm going to be making popcorn, And I'm gonna sit back and watch the heads explode of all the people in Wellesley that don't want change because they're not gonna be able to stop it, and it's going to be amazing. It is by right multifamily housing, and people, we did the easiest, simplest thing, just like Newton, to avoid a referendum, and we got really slammed by the chamber, but we're gonna build stuff. And people are gonna be, they're gonna be upset and shocked, and then you know what, their lives are gonna be fine.
Yeah.
There's nothing's gonna go wrong, everything's gonna be fine, and in 5 years, they won't even remember that the housing wasn't there.
So 2 points. Thank you, our responders. I would have 2 asterisks. One is your involvement doesn't have to be the involvement of an Ann Mara or Amy Daines or a Deb or a Heidi. Sometimes we just need people to show up. So don't worry about getting too much to do. We have a role for everyone. And secondly, I think I've contacted almost everyone in this room for fundraising for GBIO. This is why GBIO needs your financial support. We have organizers that help us force these state regulations. GBIO. So if you've lost the email from me, I'll send you another one. Edith, sing us out.
Thank you to our panelists. Well, thank you all for coming out. We have several upcoming events being sponsored by Racial Justice Initiative. Many of you have already made contributions to our toy drive for the annual Trotter School. I packed up the first load today. But if you are so inclined, we have an Amazon registry and you can order or take your grandkids shopping and let them pick out something to put in. We have several events coming up for Martin Luther King Day. With Shauna, we're planning a dinner and concert with Rabbi Lapidus, who's from the temple in Atlanta, and his partner, Melvin Miles, from Ebenezer Baptist Church, Martin Luther King Church, and they're going to do a concert. Saturday morning, they're going to do Minion. Sunday, they're doing something with the school. And then on January 19th, Saucy and Renee, who's online, are co-chairing our Martin Luther King Community Service Day. So that's 10 to 12 plus lunch on that Sunday. Our trip to Washington, DC, January 31st to February 3rd is on. We have enough people interested in going, and I think there's still room if you want to come. It's both, Vanessa publicized it as Jewish in the Heart of the Nation. It's really an RJI and adult trip. Saturday, we're going to the National Museum of African American History. We're going to the MLK. We'll do the Havdalah at the MLK Memorial. Monday, we're meeting with Rabbi Jonah Pesner from the RAC in the room where the civil rights legislation was drafted in 1965 in the RAC conference room, and we'll hear a little bit of the history of that. So if you're interested in coming, it's on the website, call me, whatever.
The Winter Walk, Bud Schramm is co-chairing with Eric Cockburn, and we'll have more information coming shortly about that. I think there's something else too. Anyways, so I hope you'll continue to join with us and